I always start my podcast with our family. And from the moment we're born, our family helps shape our personality, our values, and the preparation for our future. You grew up in Meadville, Pennsylvania, a town of 12,000 people in an Irish family. Your mom was an accountant and a homemaker. Your dad was a tool and die manufacturer and a factory worker. You have three siblings, but I want to start with your mom. You wrote in your book, it was very raw, that you didn't like her very much growing up. In fact, at various points of the book, you said you hated her. Can you
Hmm.
talk about your relationship with your mother?
Yeah, I can. I like to start out by saying, well, we don't hate each other, and I like her now. Um, uh, but it was complicated because my mother had such an horrific childhood, um, which, when you're a kid, and particularly kids of Depression era um, parents, or kids, I'm sure, who were Holocaust survivors, um, you don't really know about your parents' childhood. Not only that they had such horrible childhoods, but that their best way of survival was not talking about their childhood. And my mother was born into just terrible poverty, real, what was called hillbilly poverty, where I come from. And there were 5 kids in her family, um, one of whom was killed by a drunk driver and actually knocked right out of my mother's hand crossing the street. And she was killed and thrown in the air and came back down and was dead when she hit the ground as a very small child. Um, my mother still says she remembers the state trooper who carried her into the house and put her to bed because she remembers his big hat. Um, she had rickets and scurvy from malnutrition and the just extreme uh, poverty. Her mother walked miles every day to the welfare office to try to get welfare tickets to feed her children. Her mother was a housekeeper, and her mother was a housekeeper. When during those times, there were signs in the windows of the stores that said, "No dogs, no Irish," which is something that I think people don't really realize, especially now during the Black Lives Matter movement. Certainly, a lot of people in our country have forgotten that Irish were considered people of color in that time. And it was a very difficult period um, for all Irish immigrants. And my mother was just so abused and beaten so badly by her father, as was her mother, that she went to school and she was bleeding through the back of her gym suit and was taken to the principal's office to see why. And it was as her father had beaten her, and child welfare services gave my mother away to a family whom the mother had asthma and was unable to take care of her children. So my mother became the live-in maid, washwoman, housekeeper, cook for this family when she was 9. And so she went to school and she saved her nickels and dimes that she was given to take the bus to buy her own winter coat, for example. Um, and that's how she grew up. And for my mother, that was an incredible stroke of good luck and great good fortune. And to this day, she considers that family that took her in as the greatest thing that ever happened to her and her greatest luck. Not that she was a child laborer, a child servant, and have never, ever had a day of childhood. And so she and my father married when they were 16 and 17, respectively. And that was her life. So she didn't really understand how to treat children like children. or to be a parent who would hug her kids, for example, or tell her kids that she loved them or that they were terrific or any of that kind of parent thing, because there was nothing in her life that would have ever led her to believe that that was a parental activity.
We have some interesting similarities in our background. My grandmother was raised in foster care, and one day when she was 6 years old and her sister was 7 years old, their mother had left. Their dad dropped them off on the street corner in Detroit and says, "I can't take this anymore." And they found a Christian church that took them in, gave them some food and shelter, but they split them up when they were younger. And my grandmother bounced around to a lot of different foster care homes. And she lived with a family who basically treated her like a maid. She had to sleep in a closet, and she was the maid. She cleaned the floors. She did not eat with the family. She ate separately. But she met my grandfather when he was 16, and she married him when he was 16 as well. So I certainly can sympathize with the foster care background, and it's one of the causes I support very much is foster care. Let's talk about your grandmother as well. You said that in the book, there's never been someone as beautiful as her. What was your relationship with your grandmother? And then how did your mom and grandmother, what was the mix there in terms of how they influenced you when you were growing up?
Well, my grandmother, who was my father's mother, my father came from extraordinary wealth when he was born. He was born into an oil family in Oil City, Pennsylvania. But when he was little, there was a terrible, well, they said it was an accident, but there is some speculation over whether it was an accident, and the oil well blew and killed everyone on the oil site. His partner, who was his brother, my great uncle, died, and then my grandfather died of pneumonia quickly after that. And in those days, the money didn't go to women. Women had no rights. So my grandfather's money did not go to my grandmother. It went to my great uncle's 18-year-old son. And so you can imagine how that went. So my grandmother went from being quite wealthy to being completely broke, destitute very quickly. And my dad, when he was 4, and my uncle, when he was 3, were given to another uncle who first, and then his great grandmother, and they lived in someone's barn stalls and did farm work. And my grandmother went to work in an asylum and took her daughter, Vaughn, with her. And that's how that side of the family grew up until my father worked and bought back the family home, and everybody moved back in there when my uncle came home from the Navy, and he joined the Navy when he was about 15 or 16, which you can just imagine the life on a Navy ship for a 15 or 16-year-old boy. So I thought my grandmother was like pretty tough, pretty amazing, pretty cool that she pulled it all back together.
Let's talk about your grandfather for a few minutes. We all have had, in your case, you particularly had something very bad happen that influenced your life for a very long period of time. When you were 9 years old, your grandfather died and you were happy to see him dead. Can you talk about...
I was 14
Oh, you were 14?
He died.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You were 14 when he died. And you were happy to see him dead. What had happened there? And can you talk about what you experienced and how that influenced you going forward?
Yes. My grandfather was a pedophile, and of course, I have no real understanding of how that worked itself out with my mom and her sisters. Her sisters all died in their early 60s and had incredible mental health issues. My mother was the only one that sustained and survived. he was a horrible, broken creature and extremely abusive to my grandmother. He beat her constantly and beat her violently. And I had never seen death before. My sister and I went up to his coffin, and she asked me if he was really dead, and I didn't know. And so she asked me to touch him to make sure he was dead. And so I poked him, and we realized he was dead, and we were at the same time freaked out and thrilled that this horrible creature was done. But it's a terrible way for a child to process death for the first time, for it to be a great thing. But it was an awful experience and an awful day. And the whole situation of the funeral was not like a normal funeral where people sit down and grieve. It was a funeral where all the seats were empty and everyone stood in the back of the room in tight little clusters, murmuring. And there was no service. No one spoke. And eventually everyone just kind of dwindled out the back. It was a nightmare.
Let's go back to the happier part of your childhood. I want to talk about what you were like as a kid and what did you do for fun?
Well, I was a very precocious kid because I started walking and talking really, really early. And that was very frightening for my parents. I started painting and all kinds of things when I was really little. And so my parents started taking me to get all kinds of tests. I felt a little like a science experiment. So I started school really early. I started second grade when I was 5. And that was really strange for the teachers and the testers, because you've got to remember this was like 1963. So I'm in second grade in 1963, and the teachers are like, super freaked out, and I'm already writing in cursive and telling them like, no, I don't think that's correct. And I'm that precocious kid who's like raising my hand constantly and telling the teacher, no, I think it's Edgar Allan Poe, and the teacher just kind of had it with me. And so then they were like, well, we think she has to go back to first grade because she doesn't have any social consciousness. She doesn't know how to behave. So basically, I think I was just too much of a pain in the ass. So about halfway through that first year, they put me in the chair attached to my desk and slid me down the hallway to first grade, where, of course, I was even less of a fit in because I was already halfway through second grade and advanced. And so then they just started doing this thing where this was the era of lots of testing on kids. So the speed reading machine with the crank on the side came in, and then all of the tests with the playing cards and fill out these tests and do this test and do that test. So basically, I became the guinea pig of my school. So that's what I was doing as a kid. I was a guinea pig. And then, by the time I got to fourth grade, they were doing these Mensa tests. And so I was put in this special program, taken out of class with the rest of the kids. And there was a few of us, and we were taken into, because I was from such a small town, we were taken into the cafeteria. And we went to school in the cafeteria for 3 years. And we did all of those, when the train leaves the station at this many miles per hour and there's this many people on the train, or put all the states and all of their capitals in alphabetical order. And the real test wasn't the states and their capitals, but if you did the states and their capitals separately. It was how you read the question. So, and then if you won, you got the hula hoop or the gum or whatever, so it was all this kind of competitive game playing. And so then by the time I was in, I guess, ninth grade, they started doing a whole lot of other kind of testing. And then they brought people to the school to start to talk to me about the tests that I took. And then by 10th grade, I was going to college while I was going to high school. And then pretty soon after that, I was just going to college.
Let's talk about one of the tests. You took a IQ test. IQ stands for intelligence quotient. And the tests are basically tools designed to measure your intellectual ability and potential. And there's general scale. It goes like this. The average score is 100, and 98% of the people taking the test score below 130. If you get a 135 to 144, it says you're highly gifted. If you get a 145 to 154, the experts call you a genius. You hit a 154, which means you're at the high end of the genius range. How old were you when you took that test? And
the first
did you know what it meant?
Well, I've tested between 154 and 164 or 8 or something. I've taken a bunch of them. I mean, I've taken so many of them. But the first one was, I think, 158, I think. 158 maybe was the first one. But I was 4, I think, when I took that, or 5. Well, I didn't think anything of it when I took it because I was little. I was 5. What do I think of it? Nothing.
But later on, you must have, at some point, you kept taking these tests again, and you knew you were intellectually gifted at some point.
Well, finally, I made my sister take them because the ridiculous thing I thought was that I was the only one in the family getting them. Like, why not test the rest of the kids? It's like, it can't be just me. And ultimately, once we were grown, I told my sister, go online and take these tests. It can't be just me. It's ridiculous that they didn't test everybody else. And so she took it and she came off at like 145 or 147. And I was like, see, it's not just me.
Let's forget the test. Let's go back to the plays in the driveway when you were a kid. I want to talk about fun and when you started thinking about your future. At what age? Tell us about the plays in the driveways. And then at what age did you first think, gosh, someday I want to be in the movie business?
Well, I mean, the plays in the driveway became because I was obsessed with films. And I was that kid because on Saturday, we got all the old movies. With the 3 channels, we got all these great old movies. And I was just obsessed with these movies. I mean, like my face was like 4 inches from the TV screen. So that was the first argument was you're sitting too close to the TV, slide back. It was as though something was going to happen to me because I was too close to the television. And my father thought I was just insane because I didn't want to go outside and play. I wanted to see these movies constantly. And I didn't care if it was the black and white detective movies where they're like, we're going to send you to Siberia. I loved that. Or beautiful, I just love Barbara Stanwyck. And I thought her movies were so fabulous. And I loved, the dancing Fred Astaire movies, Gene Kelly. I thought this was all so great. And I was just obsessed. And so I wanted to start doing these plays. And we had a 2-stall garage in the front, barn in the back thing. And so I set up the picnic table. So there was a bench in the front, then the table, and then I put one of the benches on the picnic table. So I thought we had 3 tiers of bleacher seating. And then I would make the kids in the neighborhood and my sister be in the plays. And I would use, whatever we had hanging around, these fur hats and kitchen towels that I would sew into costumes and, these Christmas lights and everything. And make one stall one set and the other stall another set, and I would change these sets and put the garage doors up and down. And then I had this little record player that I would use little pieces of, this beginning of a song or the middle of a song as my little, scene set change, music, so I could score my plays. I had the whole thing going. I just, I was a full-on director, producer making these plays. By the time I got to Los Angeles, of course, I didn't realize that women weren't allowed to direct and produce until I got here. And I was like, are you freaking kidding me? And I did Basic Instinct, and I went into the studio and I was like, I would like to have like a really small amount of money to direct a movie. And they're like, get out of here. And I'm like, no, but like we made this really big success. I just want a really small amount of money. Like a really small amount of money. I have an idea for a movie and I really can do this. And they're like, leave my office. I mean, it was like I was, coming in there and asking them if I could kill their executive staff. They just thought I was nuts.